The frozen pond. I've lived in this town my whole life, and if there's one thing you can count on, it's the cold. Winters here are brutal. Snow piles up so high it swallows cars, and the wind cuts through layers like they're nothing. But my son Jake loves it. Every year, we go ice fishing at a small pond about a mile from our house. It's nothing special, just a quiet spot surrounded by bare trees and silence. That day, the ice was thick, the sky was overcast, and the air had that heavy stillness that comes before a storm. We had our gear, a thermos of hot chocolate, and planned to spend the afternoon pulling up perch. But the second I started drilling into the ice, I knew something was off. The auger cut through the frozen surface smoothly at first, but then it hit something soft. That didn't make sense. The ice was at least 8 inches thick, solid enough to hold a truck. I leaned in, peering down as water began to bubble up. That's when I saw it. Something big and dark, just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a log, maybe some debris frozen in place. But then Jake gasped, "Dad, it's moving." My stomach dropped. It was shifting slightly with the water, slow and heavy, like something was drifting just below us. I grabbed my hook, trying to snag whatever it was, but the moment the metal touched it, I felt resistance, something dense, wrapped in layers of fabric. And then a shape. A hand out. I jerked my hand back like I'd been burned. My brain refused to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't possible. It had to be something else, some kind of debris, maybe an old mannequin someone dumped. But deep down, I knew better. The tarp was too deliberate, too tightly wrapped. My pulse hammered in my ears as I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him back. "Stay behind me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My first instinct was to run, to get the hell off that ice, but I forced myself to do the responsible thing. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My fingers were stiff from the cold, making the call feel like it took an eternity to go through. When the dispatcher answered, I struggled to find the right words. There's a body in the ice. A body wrapped in a tarp. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, but I barely heard her. My focus was locked on that thing beneath the ice. It wasn't floating aimlessly anymore. It was sinking, slowly, like something was pulling it down. The tarp shifted slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a face, just the outline, blurred and distorted by the water. Then, without warning, the whole thing slid deeper, vanishing into the darkness. My stomach turned to stone. I knew what I saw. Jake knew what he saw, and yet it was just gone. I heard sirens in the distance, but all I could do was stand there, gripping my son's hand so tightly his fingers must have gone numb. I kept telling myself the cops would get here soon, that they'd figure this out. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to make any sense. The police showed up fast. 2 squad cars, lights flashing, tires crunching against the packed snow. A couple of officers stepped out, looking around like they expected to see something obvious, something explainable. I waved them over, still gripping Jake's shoulder, and tried to explain what we saw. "It was right there," I said, pointing at the hole in the ice. "Wrapped up in a tarp. We tried to pull it up, but it just sank." One of the officers, a guy in his 50s with a thick mustache, exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping onto the ice. He walked carefully to the hole, shining his flashlight into the water. His face didn't change, just that same skeptical cop look I'd seen 100 times on TV. "You sure about what you saw?" he asked, and I felt a flash of frustration. "I know what I saw," I snapped. My son saw it too. Jake nodded beside me, his face pale. The younger officer, probably fresh out of the academy, knelt by the hole and reached in with a long metal hook, stirring the water. Nothing, just dark, freezing water and shifting slush. No tarp, no body, just emptiness. My stomach twisted. I could still feel the weight of it when I hooked it, the way it resisted when I pulled. It wasn't just in my head, but now, with nothing to show, I could feel the doubt creeping in, not just from the cops, but in myself. The older officer sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "We'll take a look around," he said, already sounding unconvinced. "But if there's something down there, it's gone now." One of the officers radioed for more backup, while the other started scanning the area with a flashlight. I stood there, teeth clenched, watching as they walked the perimeter of the pond like they expected to find some easy explanation. Jake was gripping my sleeve so hard his knuckles were white. "Dad," he whispered, voice trembling. "What if it comes back?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what it was. All I knew was that there had been something there, something real, solid, heavy, and now it was gone, like it had never been there at all. The thought made my skin crawl. The ice was too thick for anything to just sink. If it wasn't there now, that meant something had moved it. But who? And how? Then, The younger officer called out, "Hey, we're gonna want to see this." His voice had that tight, uneasy edge that made my stomach drop. He was standing a few feet away from the shoreline, his flashlight pointed at the snow. I walked over, pulling Jake along with me, and felt my breath hitch in my throat. Footprints, leading away from the pond. They weren't ours. The treads were different, the stride was longer. And worst of all, they started right at the edge of the ice. No other prints leading toward it. Just a single trail heading straight into the woods, like something or someone had crawled out of that hole and walked away. The officers stared at the footprints, their expressions shifting from skeptical to uneasy. The older one crouched down, running a gloved hand over the impressions in the snow. "These are fresh," he muttered. "Can't be more than a few minutes old." A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I looked back at the hole in the ice, my mind racing. The body was gone. No tarp, no sign of anything sinking. Just this. Footprints leading away like whoever or whatever had been down there had simply climbed out and walked off. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to speak. "So what now? You think someone just got up and left?" The words sounded ridiculous even as I said them, but no one laughed. The younger officer took a slow step back, his breath fogging the air. "Should we follow them?" His voice was quieter now, less sure. The older cop hesitated, then shook his head. "Not in the dark. We don't know where they lead." His tone was firm, but I could tell he didn't want to admit how freaked out he was. He turned to me. "We'll send a team out at first light. Maybe there's a logical explanation." But his face said otherwise. No one wanted to be the first to admit it, but we all knew. This didn't make sense. This wasn't normal. I pulled Jake close, feeling his small frame shivering against me. "Come on," I murmured. "We're going home." The officers stayed behind, talking in low voices, but I couldn't listen. As we walked back to the truck, I kept my eyes on the woods, half expecting to see something watching us. But there was nothing, just the quiet, the cold, and the trail of footprints disappearing into the trees that I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape under the ice, the way it moved, the way it sank. And those footprints, starting at the hole like something had just stepped out of the water and kept walking. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was no explanation that made sense. Jake was just as shaken. He barely spoke on the ride home, just sat there staring out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. I kept telling myself the cops would figure it out in the morning, that maybe it really was just some kind of horrible accident, but deep down I didn't believe it. Something wasn't right. And then, just before dawn, I got a call from the sheriff's office. The voice on the other end was tense. "We followed the tracks." A pause. "You need to see this." I didn't want to go back. Every instinct told me to stay home, to lock the doors and pretend none of it had happened. But I had to know. So I drove out to the woods, the sky still a deep, early morning gray. When I got there, the officers were gathered in a tight circle, their boots crunching in the snow. One of them waved me over, and when I saw what they were looking at, my stomach turned to ice. The tracks, they just stopped. No signs of struggle, no scattered snow, no broken branches. Just a clean, sudden end in the middle of a clearing. Like whoever or whatever had been walking simply vanished. No one said a word. We just stood there, the cold seeping into our bones, staring at the impossible. The silence hung heavy, thick enough to smother any sense of comfort. My breath came out in shallow gasps, eyes scanning the empty clearing where the footprints had ceased, as though whoever or whatever had made them had never existed in the first place. The officers, the ones who had been so confident last night, now stood frozen, their faces pale and tight with confusion. "What do you think happened?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. No one knew. No one had an explanation for this. The older officer, the one with the thick mustache, was the first to speak. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, as though trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "The tracks don't just disappear like that." He ran a hand through his graying hair, a clear sign of the stress gnawing at him. "I don't know about you," the younger officer said, his voice shaky, "but I'm not staying out here any longer than I have to." I glanced at the sheriff, who stood off to the side, his eyes narrow and calculating. He was the one who had called me, the one who insisted I come. "What happened to the body?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper, but it was enough to catch the attention of everyone around me. The sheriff didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned toward a small copse of trees a few yards away. "Follow me." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn around and get out of there before whatever was out there turned its attention toward me. But I didn't have a choice. I had to know what had happened. As we walked, the air seemed to get colder, the silence more oppressive. No birds, no animals, just the sound of our boots crunching in the snow. It felt like the world had gone still, waiting for something. When we reached the trees, the sheriff stopped. He pointed to the ground. At first, I thought it was just more snow, untouched and smooth. But as I stepped closer, I saw the smear. A long, dark streak in the snow, thick like oil and glistening in the dim morning light. It led toward a shallow dip in the ground, where the snow had been disturbed. A few feet away, the earth was scraped up as if something had been dragged across it. "Is this what I think it is?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. The sheriff didn't answer right away. Instead, he kneeled down, running his fingers through the dark stain. He sniffed them, then wiped his hands on his pants, his face twisted in disgust. "It's blood," he said flatly, his voice heavy with realization. "Fresh blood." My heart raced. My breath hitched. I turned away, tried to fight the rising panic. The body in the ice hadn't just vanished. It had been dragged away. Something had gotten it, and if that wasn't bad enough, it had left a trail for us to follow. "We need to call for backup," the sheriff said, his voice low and urgent. "And we need to keep moving." But I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go any further. My mind raced with questions. Who or what could have taken that body? And why? The whole town was already steeped in rumors about the old cabin in the woods. It had been abandoned for decades, but people said strange things happened there at night. And now I was standing in the middle of this nightmare, caught between the reality of what we'd seen and the fear of what was still out there. As we pressed on, the trail of blood grew thicker, the air growing colder still, as if the forest itself were trying to swallow us whole. We finally reached the edge of the clearing where the trail had stopped. Only there was no sign of anyone or anything waiting for us. The blood trail abruptly ended at the base of a tree. It seemed almost too perfect, like whatever had happened there had been planned, choreographed. But then, just as I was about to speak, something caught my eye. It wasn't the tree, or the snow, or the footprints. It was the hole in the ground, barely visible at first, but unmistakable once I focused on it. A hole covered with snow, like something had been buried there. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I cleared away the snow. Beneath it was a dark, smooth surface, something shiny that I reached in, pulling out a large, dark object covered in IT was a tarp. And inside it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand. Not the hand of a body in the water, but a hand, cold, stiff, and frozen in place that I backed away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sheriff was at my side instantly. He glanced at the tarp, then back at me, his face pale. He didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. And that's when I heard a low, rasping sound coming from somewhere in the woods. A noise that didn't belong. And then I realized something was out there, watching us. The ice sculpture. I live in a small town in the mountains, a place where the cold winters are always a bit more intense than anywhere else. Every year, we hold a winter festival complete with an ice sculpture competition. It's a big deal for us. It brings tourists, it's a tradition, and frankly, it's one of the few things we look forward to during the long, gray months. At the time, I was just another face in the crowd. Nothing special. I had a small job at the local diner, serving coffee and chatting with the regulars who would come in, escaping their own routines for a moment. It was the morning after the first big snowfall of the season when I noticed it. I just finished my shift and was heading home when I took the usual shortcut through the town square. That's when I saw it. Right in the middle of the square, standing alone, was a new ice sculpture. At first, it didn't seem unusual. There were always a few new pieces going up, made by local artists. But as I got closer, my heart sank. This one wasn't like the others. It was a lifelike figure, frozen in a scream. The details were so precise, every muscle in the face contorted in agony. It looked like it could have been a person stuck in the middle of something awful. But the thing was, nobody knew who had made it. No artist had claimed it. No one had seen anyone working on IT first. People thought it was just a prank, some kind of dark humor thrown into the festival mix. But as the day went on, something felt off about it. The sculpture was in perfect condition, and the chilling detail in the figure's face, those wide, bulging eyes, the contorted mouth as if it were frozen mid-scream, started to unsettle me. The townspeople were whispering about it, making jokes, but I could see the unease in their eyes. It was like the air around the sculpture was different, colder somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. but it was so absurd, I pushed out of my mind. After all, we were used to strange things in our little town. Winter does that to people, makes them imagine things. Over the next few days, the town square became a kind of pilgrimage site. People came from all over to see the figure, their curiosity getting the better of them. No one knew why they were drawn to it, but they were. There was something magnetic about it. That damn scream captured an ice. But as the days passed, something started to happen. The temperature rose a little, as it always does by midday, and the sculpture began to melt. It wasn't much at first, just a few droplets of water on the ground. But as the ice thinned, something became visible inside. At first, it was hard to make out, but as it melted further, it became unmistakable that first, no one said anything. People just kept staring, unsure what they were looking at. But the longer I watched, the more I realized what was happening. There was something inside the ice, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some kind of odd reflection. But no, it was real. As the ice melted away, it became clear there was a hand inside. A human hand, frozen in place, its fingers splayed out, as if it had been trying to push through the ice, desperately trying to escape. The rest of the figure was still too encased in ice to make out, but the hand was unmistakable, pale, lifeless, and stuck in that impossible position. People started whispering, pointing at it, and gathering in small groups. There was an unease in the air, a feeling of collective dread that we couldn't shake off. Some tried to act like it was nothing, just an elaborate piece of performance art or some sick joke. But I saw it. I saw the way the hand trembled, not from the melting, but from something else. The skin, if you look closely enough, wasn't just frozen, it was decayed. There was something about the way it had been preserved, as if it had been frozen at the exact moment it had been trapped, held in time. I couldn't breathe. The town was abuzz with rumors by the time the sculpture had almost completely melted. People speculated about how it had gotten there. Was it some kind of twisted art project? But there was one thought none of us could ignore. The hand, frozen and decayed, wasn't the only thing that had been trapped inside. As more of the ice gave way, we saw it. What looked like the body of a person twisted unnaturally. The figure wasn't just screaming. Its body was bent in ways no human should ever be bent. But the worst part? The face. The eyes were wide, bloodshot, and bulging, as if they'd been staring at something horrific, something no one could understand. It felt wrong, like it was alive, even though it was clearly just a figure frozen in time that I didn't know what to do. I wanted to walk away, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, like my feet were stuck in the snow. I could hear people behind me talking, gasping, some even crying, but I couldn't look away. The melted ice began to pool around the figure, forming small puddles that reflected the horror in front of us. And then it happened. I could have sworn, just for a second, that I saw the figure's mouth twitch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a wave of cold terror down my spine. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but no. The mouth had definitely moved. It was like the figure was trying to scream, but it couldn't. It was trapped in the ice, forever. The moment the mouth twitched, something in the crowd shifted. It went from whispers to outright panic. People started backing away, some running in the opposite direction, others just standing there, frozen in shock like me. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sense of dread that only grew stronger as I watched the ice continue to melt, bit by bit. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was what we all heard next. A faint, wet sound like something dragging across the ground. I couldn't tell where it came from, but it was there, growing louder and louder, like it was coming from inside the sculpture itself. My heart was pounding in my chest as I strained to hear. And then, as the last chunk of ice slid off the figure, we saw it. Something was emerging from inside the body. That IT wasn't just a person anymore. It was something else, something wrong. There, in the puddle of water that had formed around the figure, with a mass of writhing, blackened worms, twisting in and out of the decayed flesh. It looked like the body had been infested with them, and now they were escaping, slithering free. The town square was filled with screams. Some people collapsed, others ran, but no one could escape what was happening in front of us. The worms were everywhere now, crawling up the legs of the figure, over its face, through the puddles of melting ice. It was like the sculpture had been a vessel for something much darker, something we couldn't comprehend. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The horror didn't stop there. The moment those worms began to slither away from the body, the ice sculpture, what was left of it, seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like something had been inside the ice, waiting for it to melt, for it to break free. The ground beneath us trembled slightly, and I saw people running in all directions, screaming, trying to get away from what was happening. But it didn't matter. No one knew where to run. The cold had spread beyond the square now, creeping into the streets, and there was a heaviness in the air, like the town itself was suffocating. And in the middle of it all stood that twisted figure, now just a melting corpse surrounded by the remnants of something too awful to name. By the time the police arrived, the sculpture had completely melted, leaving only the puddles behind. No trace of the body, no sign of the worms, nothing. But the town would never be the same again. People stopped coming to the square. The festival was called off, and in the weeks that followed, more and more people started to leave. There were rumors, whispers about what had really happened, about what the sculpture had been. I never found out the truth, but every time I pass through the square now, I can't help but glance at the spot where it all took place. And I swear, sometimes, just for a moment, I can still hear that scream. A faint echo carried on the wind. The winter road trip, it was December of 2018, and my wife, Claire, and I were driving through the Rockies to visit her family for the holidays. We've been married for just over a year, and this was our first big road trip together. I remember how excited we were, blasting Christmas music and laughing about how cheesy it all was. But the mood shifted when the snow started falling hard. What began as a light flurry turned into a full-blown storm within minutes. The roads were icy, and the visibility was so bad that I could barely see past the hood of our car. Claire was nervous, gripping the dashboard every time the tires slid, but I kept telling her we'd be fine. After all, I'd driven in snow before, or at least I thought I had. This was something else entirely. The mountains loomed around us like silent giants, and the wind howled like it was alive, pushing against the car like it didn't want us there. But that's when we saw him. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the swirling snow. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat that looked too thin for the weather, and his arm was outstretched, thumb pointing toward the sky. Claire hesitated. She's always been the cautious one, but I figured we couldn't just leave someone out there in this mess. I pulled over, and the man climbed into the back seat without a word. He had this strange calm about him, like the storm didn't bother him at all. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were so dark they looked black. He introduced himself as Eli and thanked us quietly, his voice low and gravelly. When Claire asked where he was headed, he just said, "Up the road a bit. No specifics, no explanation." I remember exchanging a quick glance with her, but neither of us said anything. What would we do? Kick him back out into the storm? So we kept driving, the tension in the car growing thicker with every mile. Claire and I just stared at the map for what felt like forever, the sound of the wind outside fading into the background. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. How'd he know where we lived? Why did he leave a bloody glove? And how the hell did he just disappear like that? Claire was the first to speak. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, pulling out my phone, but of course there was no signal. Not a single bar. The storm had knocked out whatever weak connection we might have had out here. I tried to stay calm, but my hand was shaking as I started the car. "Let's just get out of here," I said, more to myself than to Claire. She didn't argue. The drive back onto the highway was a blur. The snow was coming down harder now, and the road was barely visible. Every shadow, every tree branch swaying in the wind made me jump. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Eli sitting there again, but the back seat stayed empty. Claire was quiet, clutching the map in her hands like it was some kind of cursed object. I wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, that we'd figure this out, but the words stuck in my throat. About 20 minutes later, we saw the lights of a small town up ahead. It wasn't much, just a few buildings and a diner, but it felt like a lifeline. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, the tires crunching on the snow, and we hurried inside. The warmth hit us like a wave, but it didn't do much to ease the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The diner was nearly empty, just an elderly couple in a corner booth and a tired-looking waitress behind the counter. We sat down at a table near the window, and Claire immediately spread the map out in front of us. The red circle around our address seemed to pulse like it was alive. I couldn't stop staring at it. "What does this mean?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the diner's heater. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go home. Not yet. Not until we figure out who Eli was and what he wanted. The waitress came over, her expression softening when she saw how shaken we looked. "You two okay?" she asked, pouring coffee into our mugs without waiting for an answer. I forced a smile and nodded, but Claire didn't even look up. She was too busy tracing the red circle with her finger, like she was trying to erase it. After a few minutes, the waitress came back with our food, burgers and fries that neither of us had the stomach to eat. As she set the plates down, she glanced at the map and froze. Her face went pale, and she took a step back like she'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Claire and I exchanged a look. "We found it," I said, not sure how much to tell her. The waitress shook her head, her eyes wide. "That's Eli's map," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He comes in here sometimes. Always sits in that booth over there." She pointed to a corner booth, the same one where the elderly couple had been sitting just minutes ago, except now it was empty. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean comes in here?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. The waitress hesitated, then leaned in closer. "He's not, right?" she said. "People say he died out there on the mountain years ago, but he still shows up sometimes, especially during storms." The storm only got worse as we climbed higher into the mountains. The windshield wipers were struggling to keep up with the snow, and the tires kept losing traction on the icy road. Eli sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window like he was lost in thought. Every now and then, I'd catch him in the rearview mirror, and it always felt like he was watching me, not the storm. It made my skin crawl, but I tried to brush it off. Claire, though, wasn't having it. She kept glancing back at him, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. Finally, she broke the silence. "So Eli," she said, her voice a little too bright, "what brings you out here in this weather?" He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, I thought he hadn't heard her. Then he leaned forward, his face inches from the back of my seat, and said, "I had some business to take care of." His breath smelled metallic like copper, and I swear I felt it on the back of my neck. Claire didn't ask any more questions after that. About an hour later, the gas light came on. I cursed under my breath. I'd been so focused on the road that I hadn't even noticed how low we were. The nearest station was a tiny, run-down place just off the highway, and it looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The pumps were covered in snow, and the flickering neon sign above the door buzzed like a dying insect. I pulled up to one of the pumps and turned to Eli. "We're just gonna fill up real quick," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, but didn't say anything. Claire and I got out of the car, and the cold hit us like a wall. The wind was so loud it was hard to hear each other, but I remember Claire grabbing my arm and whispering, "Something's not right with him." I didn't argue. I filled the tank as fast as I could, my hands numb from the cold, and when I got back in the car, Eli was gone. The back seat was empty, but the door was still closed. And on the seat where he'd been sitting, there was a single bloodstained glove and a folded map. My heart dropped when I opened it. Our home address was circled in red. Claire and I just sat there, staring at the waitress like she'd just told us the world was ending. My mind was spinning, trying to process what she'd said. A ghost? That couldn't be real. But then again, how else could Eli have just vanished like that? And the glove, the map, the way he'd looked at us in the car, it all added up to something I couldn't explain. The waitress must have seen the disbelief on our faces because she sighed and said, "I know how it sounds, but you're not the first people he's followed." She glanced over her shoulder, like she was afraid he might walk in at any moment. "Last winter, a trucker came in here saying he'd picked up a hitchhiker who disappeared halfway through the pass, left behind a bloody scarf and a note with his home address." My blood ran cold. "What happened to him?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The waitress shook her head. "Don't know. Never saw him again." We stayed in the diner for what felt like hours, nursing our coffee and trying to come up with a plan. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the thought of getting back on the road made my stomach churn. But we couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, the waitress offered to let us use the diner's landline to call the police. It took a few tries, but we finally got through to a dispatcher who promised to send someone out to check on our house. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. All I could think about was that red circle on the map and the way Eli had looked at me in the rearview mirror. Claire must have been thinking the same thing because she suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "What if he's already there? What if he's waiting for us?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go home. Not until we were sure it was safe. We ended up staying in a motel just outside the town, a dingy little place with flickering lights and a smell that reminded me of wet carpet. Claire didn't say much as we checked in, and I didn't push her. I could tell she was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The room was cold, and the heater rattled like it was on its last legs, but at least it was better than being out in the storm. We sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the map we'd spread out on the nightstand. The red circle around our address seemed to taunt us, a reminder that no matter how far we ran, Eli, or whatever he was, had found us. "What do we do?" Claire asked finally, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was pull her close and promise her we'd figure it out. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed it. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, and the sun was shining like nothing had happened. It felt wrong, like the world was mocking us. We checked out of the motel and drove back to the diner to see if the waitress had heard anything from the police. She hadn't, but she did give us a piece of advice that stuck with me. Don't go home until you're sure he's gone. And if you see him again, don't stop. Just keep driving. We thanked her and got back on the road, but this time we didn't head home. Instead, we drove to the nearest police station, about an hour away. The officers there listened to our story, but I could tell they didn't believe us. Still, they agreed to send a patrol car to our house to check things out. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When the police called us later that day, they said everything at our house looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no strange footprints in the snow, nothing. They even checked the security cameras, but there was no footage of anyone matching Eli's description. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. If anything, it made me feel even more uneasy. How could someone just vanish like that? And why had he targeted us? Claire and I stayed with her parents for a week after that, too scared to go back home. When we finally did, the house felt different, like the walls were watching us. We changed the locks, installed new security cameras, and even got a dog, but it didn't help. Every time I looked out the window at night, I half expected to see Eli standing there, staring back at me with those dark, empty eyes. It's been 5 years since that night, and we've never seen or heard from Eli again. But I still think about him sometimes, especially during snowstorms. Claire and I don't talk about it much. It's like an unspoken rule between us. But every now and then, I'll catch her staring at the map we kept, the one with the red circle around our address. We never figured out who Eli was or what he wanted, and I doubt we ever will. All I know is that he changed something in us, something deep and permanent. We don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. We don't even stop for gas in remote areas if we can help it. And every time we drive through the mountains, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's something else. Either way, I'll never forget the way he looked at me in that rearview mirror, like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting,